Welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining the group and doing this interview, Hannah. My name is Nick Long. I'm the owner of the Orca group, Killer Whales. And thank you for joining this interview. It's the first of its kind on the group, which is great. Hopefully we'll have more of them. Today we're interviewing Hannah. She's the author of a book that she's going to be talking about. And we have Elena, of course, you know Elena from the group, and she's one of our experts. So we're going to do a quick intro and tell everyone exactly who we are and what we're doing here today. So I'm Nick. I own a group. I'm from Ireland. I've been a fan of orca whales most of my life, but I'm certainly not an expert in them. Hannah and Elena would be far miles ahead of me in terms of their biology and everything, the cultural and aspects and everything else about it. So I'll pass it on over to Elena now, and she'll introduce herself.
Hi, guys. So my name's Elena Lawson, and I'm an amateur cetologist. I have a degree in marine biology, and I'm going forward with that and doing independent studies and research. I've been doing anti-captivity activism as well as working with Mark Lear and Young occasionally, doing ghostwriting for interviews kind of around the world. And I'm a silent partner for that stuff. I've never been on interviews before that were me interviewing anyone else for this. So this is a first for me, and I'm pretty excited. I'm an orca enthusiast as well. When I was 4, I saw a killer whale in SeaWorld, and that was it. That was all I ever wanted to do. My dad kept telling me to go to college for something that was manageable and something that I could go to work for. And so I did that for a while, and then I just kept coming back to marine biology, and he kept shaking his head, and here we are.
Cool. And Hannah?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm delighted to be part of this group. Well, my role, of course, is that I'm the author of the killer whale journals that we will be talking about. And I did a degree on killer whales, killer whale acoustics in northern Norway. I'm from Denmark, but I work in Norway. And today my profession is that I'm director of exhibitions at the Whale, which is a museum that will be built about whales in northern Norway. And then on the side I write, and I love writing.
Well, you do it very well.
Yeah. And I think what we'll do is we'll start this interview with Elena has a kind of a introduction to the book and how she felt about it, and talk about certain points, and then we'll pass it back to you, Hannah, to kind of react to
that. Wonderful.
All right, so I started out reading the killer whale journals, and I read up to about chapter 6, and then I kind of switched gears because I was really enjoying everything that you wrote, and I was like, has she written more? And then I kind of Googled you and found A Modest Genius, and I read A Modest Genius and then finished the killer whale journals. And I was so excited. I read it in like 3 days, both of them in 3 days. And I couldn't put either book down really, because you have such a gift of bringing your experience to an accessible level to other people. And for someone who's never been in the field and never worked out in the field with orca or, in any biological fields, it made me feel like I was a fly on the wall. I loved every single experience that you shared. And then I loved how your books did kind of intertwine in certain places. And so it filled in gaps in history and stories that I'd never heard before that just kind of made a lot of other stories make sense. As the book continues, it gets a little bit more heavy, from personal experience to some tragedy with some of the orcas in the North Atlantic. And I had remembered reading a few things from a few other books. Eric Holt had mentioned things on culling, and John Hargrove had mentioned things about the United States killing killer whales for relations with Iceland. And I cried. I'm such a dang baby, because it was emotional to read that. But of course, things are getting better. And I love that the attitudes are changing all over the world and people are looking at killer whales a different way. And it's just been such a short gap between the 1960s and now that everything is really coming together. And instead of being completely feared and annoyed for everyone, everyone is starting to really love these animals and want to protect them and want to make laws to keep them around. I really appreciate that perspective because yours is actually fairly unique. And I think that it's funny that you use the term political hot potatoes, but you're not wrong. All of these topics, they do incite a lot of feelings with a lot of people, but I think it's going in a positive direction. So my impression is positive change.
Yes, thank you. That's probably also what I really wanted to communicate, that change is possible, that minds can change. And I've tried to look into what does it take. Knowledge for sure is a huge part in changing attitudes. Local pride can also shift. You can develop when other people admire what you have, you become proud of it, and that I have seen in Norway. I have seen how attitudes change there, because all these people from all over, mainly Europe, but also Australia and the States and many other places, come to watch the whales, mainly the killer whales, but also other species of whales, and they just think it's fantastic. And then local people say, wow, they come far away to see what we have. So yeah, attitudes can change.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
So what would you say, Hanne, would be like this book is an amazing book, but what would you say that is the main reasons for you behind the book, and what message would you like to give out to the world with the book?
Well, that has actually changed a little bit through the writing process, because I started by collecting stories that I thought were never really told, or not told in any depth, about killer whales. And I thought we should know these stories better, because first of all, because they're really interesting. So I picked up stories from different parts of the world, which I thought that is a really cool and interesting story. And then I think I somehow realized that all the stories I collected were about our relationship with them. It was, did we fear them? Did we persecute them? Did we love them? I mean, it was all about people and killer whales. So that became like a thing throughout the book. And then it became more and more looking into how have we looked upon these animals? How has that changed? What does it take to change? So now I would say the book is about those things. It's about change and how we can change. And to some degree, it's also about respecting and understanding that there are many different cultures in the world and many different attitudes, and it's hard to change attitude if you don't meet people halfway. You have to somehow go in and also want to understand their culture and why they are worried about the killer whale's presence, or whatever is going on.
Interesting. What do you think, Elena?
Well, absolutely, the communication. I mean, Hanne did go into, taverns and bars and talk to people, and she met them there in her stories. And so everyone that she came to, she was very open-minded. She obviously wanted to change their mind, and she wanted to introduce more powerful ideas that would protect the species and help keep them from being, viewed as pests or being viewed as very, voracious creatures, which they are and they aren't. And so being able to use those flexible terms interchangeably, using orca and killer whale together interchangeably, it does help when you look at a certain audience. People view it differently. So one of the things that I really appreciated about her approach was that, you know, she did meet them halfway, and she did say, like, I respect your culture and I respect why you guys are, you know, doing what you're doing. And it brings into question all of these plays on true ethics and good discussion moving forward for real ethics and ocean ethics.
Yeah, I really think that's necessary. There's this wonderful story in the book, at least I think is wonderful, where there's a whaling ship coming into the town where I work, and this is whaling is actually still going on in Norway.
Yeah.
And
It's cultural.
What?
It's cultural with the pilot whales.
Yeah, well, it's minke whales, but
Minke whales, yeah.
I wanted to talk to them about whaling, and so I went on board, and they were actually very nice and invited me to sit down, and they invited me to have a whale steak, which I declined, but I accepted the coffee, and then we started talking, and we were far apart, but it wasn't a fight. It was just an exchange of what do you think and what do you think. And then I brought this this video of killer whales hunting herring underwater, where they move in a very coordinated fashion. It's like watching a wolf pack surround some bison or something. They surround the herring, they work with them, they get the ball of herring tighter and tighter. And these whalers, they've never seen anything like it. And I didn't turn them around like this, but they were certainly intrigued and fascinated. And this is where it starts. You have to become fascinated and think, oh, that's cool. And so it's small steps. And at least these two whalers, they left with an appreciation of how smart killer whales were. For sure, they understood that. And then we'll just wait and see what happens next. At least killer whales are not killed in Norway. It's been a long, long time since they were. But it takes time to change attitudes. It really it does.
And talking about attitudes, at the start of your book, you talk about how you were surprised about getting information from the actual boaters and the residents in Norway about where the whales were located. Can you tell us a little bit about how the attitudes of the Norwegian people were back then to compare to how they are now?
Yeah, at that time, Norwegian fishermen, people we met in the harbors, fishermen or people who worked on fishing boats or their wives, or they didn't like killer whales at all. The herring fishery had collapsed 10 years earlier, and it was a grand collapse. It was a devastating blow to the economy.
Wow.
And for a long time after, there was not really enough herring for the killer whales after this either. And the fishermen blamed this collapse on the killer whales, because every time they saw herring, they saw killer whales. So evidently it must have been the killer whales that eaten up all the herring. And at least it was necessary now to keep the numbers of killer whales down so that the herring stock could recover, they said. That actually didn't happen. The Norwegian government didn't allow a continued hunt of killer whales at this time, and the herring stock recovered with the killer whales around. And we were, I mean, they thought of us as somehow they didn't like us because we thought killer whales were cool and interesting, but they also kind of pitied us. These stupid people on this little boat, they thought the whole thing was pathetic. So every now and then they would take mercy on us, and they would tell us, well, we saw some killer whales today, or they would even call us on the VHF and say, if you go southeast, I think you can find them. I saw them just 20 minutes ago. So sometimes they would help us. And sometimes I was the cook on board. They would bring me herring that a whole bucket full of herring that I could use for the dinner. So it was a combination of, they were actually very kind and sweet, But this thing about killer whales, they weren't really sure that they agreed with us. So that was initially the thing that we were met with. I have seen a fisherman shoot at killer whales with what is it called, a rifle. And I mean, I don't think anything happened, but I did see it. And what we see now is the complete opposite thing. First of all, there's no animosity from the fishermen's side. They worry a bit about the killer whales because it happens that they get entangled in nets. They are attracted to the nets because the herring is inside the nets, and that's obviously dangerous. So they worry about getting by-catching a killer whale and how they would get it out of the net again. But they're not worried about the killer whales eating up all the herring. And we started to see fishermen, if the killer whales came close to the boat, we started seeing them posting pictures on social media. Look what came to my boat today. So the thing about pride that I mentioned before was certainly something that has moved in. They're proud. They're proud that they have this incredible nature. And it is incredible. It is really amazing. There are just so many whales, and it's such a spectacle. So I understand that they're proud. And they have it with the northern lights and with the midnight sun. I mean, they have everything. And that change has happened in 3 or 4 decades.
And there seems to be a little industry growing up there with touring boats and so on. Like, I've heard a lot of boats are actually now doing that over there. So, bringing out people to see them.
Yeah, there. I mean, since the very beginning, actually, there has been an interest in going out to see them. Journalists, photographers, people who are interested in nature, biologists, and a lot of divers too, who come. And the problem right now is that it's not really regulated very well. So it's a little bit chaotic and free for all and messy and not good, I think, for the killer whales. I think it will be necessary to regulate it quite soon. But it's become really popular, and thousands of people go there to see them.
Yeah, there are a few tours in Norway where you can put on a dry suit and snorkel with the orcas, and it's actually quite a successful tour business. It's very successful, and they have a high rate of seeing the orcas on their tours. So,
yeah,
still would love to do it.
There's a lot of that.
Yeah, the familiarization of people with the orcas is always a concern. Having them be too close to us and too comfortable with us is always a concern when it comes to proximity to wildlife. We've seen a few instances of whales like Luna and Keiko that they just get so attached, and orcas like Springer, they just get so attached to people, and it ends up being detrimental for them. So I do believe that regulations are necessary, and certain distances and certain approaches and very specific behavior in water should be regulated around orcas.
Yeah, I don't think there's any risk that these wild killer whales will grow attached to people. They have zero interest in the people. I mean, they'll pass by and just glance at people, and then they'll swim on. They're much more interested in the herring. Yeah, they're not really interested. But if there are 30 people in the water with them, it is I mean, it's dangerous, not so much, I think, because of the killer whales, but just because they're boats. It's kind of dark. It's in November. Lots of people in the water, not well marked. It is a little bit, it's a lot messy, and it's also a potential disturbance of the whales. So for that reason alone, I think it should be regulated. I'm not saying that you should never do it, but I think it should be limited to some kind of licensing system where you can manage how many you actually allow in the water.
So Hanne, you're also the director of a museum in Norway.
No, I'm not the director. I'm the director of exhibitions of this museum.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So do you think there would be any crossover between the authority that you have and the influence that you have in the orca whale community to the regulations or future regulations of the whaling or touring industry in Norway? Do you think there'd be any crossover there between the political world and the
yeah, I think there will, because the whale, as this project is called, is already in partners in several research projects. One of them is about the relationship between people and sperm whales, not killer whales, but sperm whales. And so I think by going into partnerships with different research organizations and maybe also NGOs and other organizations, I think we will probably, hopefully, be asked our opinion in some cases, and maybe also advice.
even set up a board?
Yeah. Yes, yeah, exactly.
So going back to the book, okay. So in terms of getting people to pick it up and read through it, what would you say would be the top main kind of like tastes of the book, or like the unique selling points? I'm using languages as a business person again, yeah. But like in terms of like it. Yeah, but in terms of like how would you sell the book to somebody? Like how would you say?
I would say that it is unique in the sense that I mean, first of all, I would say it's a hopeful message that you can change. Yeah. Then I think that there are a lot of unique stories that most people, even people who love killer whales, who know everything about killer whales, who have adored them for decades, I think there are stories that they haven't heard, or at least that they haven't heard in any depth. And so I think if you're interested,
I would say the depth is very important, the depth of the story.
Yeah. So I think almost if you are interested in killer whales, I think you will find those stories enlightening and entertaining at the same time.
Okay, that's great. I know from the group, okay, that we get the best responses from images and pictures. And you made a point to kind of highlight the photographer on your book. Can you talk a little bit about the photography on your book?
The photography is quite high quality, because I during some of my field studies, I became quite good friends with Paul Nicklen, and he offered that I could have some of his pictures in the book, which was incredibly generous. And he also wrote a wonderful foreword for the book. So and he's actually also one of portrayed in the book in one of the chapters as a guy who has a very close encounter with a killer whale underwater. So so his pictures are in the book, and they are, of course, gorgeous.
So people are going to get amazing stories that have never been told before about the Norwegian killer whale community, plus amazingly high quality pictures.
And amazing stories from Russia.
Oh yes, yeah, we're going to get to that.
And Iceland and Greenland and Australia. I think often you forget that killer whales is really a cosmopolitan species that you can find pretty much everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
And so this book is also, I mean, some of the stories are from Norway, but there are also stories from other places in the world, Canada, the Pacific Northwest. So there's I guess that's also a point of the book, is to demonstrate just how spread out they are geographically, and everywhere they are, we have this either hate or love relationship with them.
It's so true. In Ireland, we have them up on the west coast, the northwest coast, and they're not frequent. Okay, they do come up there, and they're in a place in Ireland where you'd nearly have to be living there to get to them, because The northwest of Ireland is kind of like, in terms of transportation, it's very difficult to get there. There's only roads. There's no like public transports and major roads there either. So it's kind of more a situation with back roads. So unfortunately, it's kind of hard to see them in Ireland, but they're also in Scotland, which they're very active right now at the moment.
Yeah.
But it's like you said, it's almost like you see so many crossovers between humans and killer whales, in terms of we've been to every continent in the world, and they've almost been to every single continent in the world, if not every continent of the world, you know.
Every continent.
Yeah.
Every continent. And because they're coastal, we tend to see them if we go out in boats, so we interact with them, we get a relationship with them. And already in the first chapter, I compare them to wolves, because we have the same difficult love-hate relationship to wolves. And wolves are also, I mean, often in places where there are people nearby.
Yeah, so true, actually. You kind of, any kind of apex predator like that kind of share similarities.
Exactly.
You mentioned Russia there, which you go into talk about the whale jail, the whale prison situation over there was kind of horrendous. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. I'm really glad that I went. I was invited and went there in 2019. Obviously, today I couldn't go. That would be impossible. And I met some really wonderful killer whale scientists that I worked with in their very remote field station, which was at a cliff top in the wilderness in Kamchatka. And I was very interested in the whale jail and in the whole story of how it fell apart, because it did. I mean, they had more than 100 belugas and killer whales in captivity, kept in these small sea pens.
Oh my God.
Almost frozen up. They had to chunk off the ice every day so that there was space enough for the whales to come up and breathe. And they successfully actually fought court cases where the capturers ended up being fined very heavily, very, very costly fines, and they were also told to release the animals again. And at the time when I was there, the court cases had already run, and they had won. I think there'd been 3 cases, and not all animals had been released yet. So what I was interested in finding out was, how was it possible to win? And I think that was a really interesting experience. I mean, obviously everything was experience because it was remote, it was wilderness, it was really beautiful. But it was also I was kind of astonished that they managed to win these court cases, and I'm full of admiration for these NGOs and their lawyers who turned this around. There was a lot of international attention and pressure on Russia. That probably helped too, but the court cases were very, very cleverly done by Russian NGOs.
It's amazing, because like you don't, if it wasn't for people like you, like it's not likely you'd hear stories like that from on an international scale. And I guess in this book, like, you will be talking about the stories of how you went up there and who you talked to and how your experiences and how they made you feel, and that's all in the book as well, which makes it very intriguing to just pick it up and get the kind of inside scoop of that. But yeah, that's a fascinating, like, we've all heard of the whale jails in Russia, but like, you're the only person I've ever known to actually go up there and experience what it's like to be actually there. So those stories would be a fascinating read, you know.
That's exactly what I was saying in the beginning, that I thought there are all these stories about killer whales that we hear, but we never really hear them in any depth.
Yeah.
So that was the point. That was to find out what really happened.
Mm.
Who was involved. And you know, one of the stars of this story is a young journalist, 29 years old, who went out alone with a drone and positioned herself not so far away from this, from the enclosure where they kept all these whales, and she filmed it. And sure enough, it didn't take long before a guard came out, saw her, walked out, saw her. He was armed with an automatic weapon, and told her to leave. And she was really brave. She said, "You can't tell me to leave. I'm totally allowed to be where I am." So she filmed it, and she told me that in the evening after she came back, she really wanted to do a full study, you know, where she edited all the material and put the whole thing together. She worked for a television company, but she just thought, I have to put it out immediately. This is so grotesque. So she some of the pictures and some of the footage already the same evening, she uploaded it to her own Facebook profile, and it exploded overnight. So she was, I think she's one of the heroes, and one of the chapters is actually dedicated to her, because she died. She died in a snowmobile accident, which was really, really sad. So there are, maybe that's, I get a little bit sentimental here, but there are really many wonderful people in Russia who are doing a lot of hard work to protect their environment, and to, I mean, the kind of work that you and I are doing too.
Like, it's kind of hard to grasp the vastness of Russia and the different like ecosystems over there. Like, it's like you said, there's people all over Russia fighting to keep these places, you know, protected, and the animals, the flora and fauna all over Russia, you know.
I just hope that their voices will continue to be heard, because they can't have the international collaborations that they had before.
Sanctions.
So I'm not really sure what will happen. The killer whales of Kamchatka are protected from capture until 2023, and then nobody knows what happens.
Well, hopefully cases like this are precedents going forward, and that they've won before. They have grounds to win again on a lot of the same points, and a lot of the conservation efforts and cruelty avoidance that we want to get to. We never want, I don't think anybody thinks when they're little that they're going to grow up and have whale jails, you know? Like, I think we need to come back to a place where we can empathize with these animals and make it very global, that they feel like us, and that they experience emotions like us and feel pain like us. I think that kind of attitude might turn things around, and it sure did in Russia. Everyone was so up in arms about the abuse happening to the animals, you know, and if things are censored, you can't get that message to people. But if you show them in person, then one by one, people will turn around.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that is exactly what it takes.
You know, Frans de Waals, he's an anthropologist. He works with monkeys primarily, but when he was working with them, he studied and realized how much they feel, and a lot of that has transferred over into anthropomorphizing animals, and it's been taboo in science for so many years. But he's almost in a movement where he wants to make it appropriate to do that for animals with high sentience, like killer whales and like belugas, you know, whales that they keep in captivity. And I think that that's a positive push. I think that we should view them that way. What are your views on, you know, just how intelligent and complex their brains are? How should we view them from someone who's more advanced in the scientific field than I am?
Well, obviously they are very intelligent, and they learn very fast, and they have very complex social systems comparable to the most complex systems that we know of in animals. I don't know if it makes sense to compare them to our intelligence and to say they're less or more, because the way that our brains are working are very, very different. A large part of their brains is taken up by acoustic processing, because that's their world is depends a lot on hearing. But judging from, I think what happens when we see animals like killer whales, when we have a meeting with killer whales, we sort of sense that they are there. They come up, they're inquisitive, they are playful, they'll poke at the little zodiac you are in, or we recognize some of their behaviors. They're checking us out. They want to see us. They turn their head and they look at us. And all those behaviors we recognize because they're not different from what we do. So and when an animal are doing things that we recognize, it's much easier for us to connect, to feel that there is a connection. And I totally think there is a connection. But I also think I have a connection with my dog. I'm not saying that they are supernatural in any way. I'm just saying that we can connect to animals in different ways. And it's much easier for us actually to connect to a killer whale than to a blackbird in our garden, because a blackbird is a bird and they're just much further away from us in an evolutionary sense. And I mean, a lot of their behavior is more difficult for us to understand. But even if killer whales live in an environment that we don't comprehend at all, they're still mammals, and a lot of their behavioral repertoire is something that we recognize. And I think that's why we connect and feel these strong ties and fascination.
It's like a recognition of consciousness, I guess, a connection to consciousness.
I think it just might be.
Yeah. Like humans anthropomorphize everything anyway, they see similarities in everything, but we have this human bias. But I think you can't fool consciousness.
But when I was a student, it was totally taboo and forbidden to anthropomorphize animals. You can't, they're different than us. You can't do that. And actually, that is probably a thing in behavioral science that has changed the most, so that now we recognize that it might be just as big a mistake to not assign them, for instance, emotions. Because if emotions are important for us to survive, there's an evolutionary reason that we have emotions. That's why we connect with our children and our partners and our social group. It is probably exactly the same for other social animals.
Well, even 12 years ago, when I started college for the first time, my sophomore year, we were doing classes and they said, don't make the mistake of thinking that animals are like us. And that was just 12 years ago. So, I mean, the way that I viewed it and changed studying orcas more in depth, it's completely changed the way that I look at animals. And writers like Carl Safina and Franz de Waal, they bring that beauty and that deep empathetic bond between animals into a very visible level. And you've done that as well with some of the interactions that you've described with killer whales. And I think that's important for people to really understand that we have empathetic bonds with each other. We're connected. Everything is connected, and it needs to stay in balance that way.
I just want to approach some stuff on wild orca for a while, and then there's a few questions that was asked from the group about captive orcas, specifically around the human psychology of going to these places. She took a quote from your book, actually, and she asked about that. But we'll talk about wild orcas specifically in North America, where we are seeing, and Canada, where we're seeing the reduction in Canuck salmon affecting the resident orcas, and the detrimental effect that's having on the population. And now with a recent study, we're seeing inbreeding and the effects of inbreeding on the community there with embolism and so on. What's your thoughts on that, Hannah?
That was a lot of questions at one time.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry about
Um, what my thoughts are about the inbreeding or the Chinook situation.
Well, it's kind of going back to your relation, what your point is with relationship between people and orca, and in that area of the world, we're seeing that the influence of humans on the habitat of the orca in that part of the world, between potentially overfishing of the Canuck salmon and dams and so on, affecting the life cycle of the Canuck salmon.
Well, yeah, now you get me started, because
yeah,
I get what
That's
you're
a
talking about.
sensitive topic. That one's hard.
If I don't know details about the population status of the Chinook salmon. I know that the southern residents depend heavily on them.
Primary food source.
And if the southern residents had first priority, I think the easiest thing would be to say, let's make a stop, and just for 5 years, and then evaluate the situation and see if we can start giving licensing out to fisheries again at some level. But it looks to me as if the southern residents do not have the first priority, that the interest of the fisheries, both the commercial fishery, but probably also leisure fishery, are so big that it's a question of making compromises and trying to find a middle way. And maybe a middle way is just not enough for these killer whales, which have been shown again and again and again to not get enough food. They get smaller if they don't get enough food. They develop the peanut heads. They have very low reproductive rates. If there were no other concerns than just the killer whales, you would of course say, let's stop fishing for a while and see if that helps.
Well, you make a very interesting point early on in this interview about the herring population in Norway.
Yeah,
you can probably see that there's a crossover there between the collapse of the herring industry in Norway and now the Canuck salmon in North America. So do you think there could be lessons learned from how the Norwegians dealt with it?
Yeah, I can say what the Norwegians did, that they practically stopped the herring fishery for more than 10 years. Wow. The quotas were very, very, very small. Compared to before, they were zero. And now the newspapers on the herring is that the herring has recovered, and it's actually the most recent paper I saw, they say it's back to historic levels. So now there's actually as much herring as there ever was before, and there are also more killer whales, because the killer whales were hunted until 1982. And so at the time when we started studying them, it was actually a population that was very low in numbers, because many hundreds had been killed in the preceding 10 years before we started studying them. And their population has grown too. So there are more herring and more killer whales than there ever was before. So the lesson, if there is a lesson to be learned from that, that is that, yet it did help to stop fishing for a while.
Well, okay. I think what's important to remember with this particular issue with the southern resident killer whales and all of the pods up that coast on the western side of North America is that they built these dams, a series of dams through that part of the river system, and the reproductive cycle of the salmon was reduced greatly because those salmon couldn't spawn and make it back in time. So a lot of that counted on timing for seasons and migration and where they are at certain types of the years, and how much fish was available. And with commercial fishing taking an extremely large quantity of a reduced population of salmon, of course the killer whales suffered. There was nothing to eat, and they have to revert to doing secondary and tertiary food sources, which are not as nutrient dense and not as healthy for them. And and there were some major oil spills in the area as well that wiped out quite a bit of their food sources and made the orcas themselves quite ill. And like you talked about in the book, a lot of petrochemicals ended up in the water, and so these animals.
But what you're doing now is making it very, very complex, and of course it is very, very complex.
It is.
But if you want to save something that is at the brink of extinction, yes. We're talking about population which is at the brink of extinction. There are 73 animals left or something like that.
73 is the count. There is a new count, but they don't count it as part of the population for a year.
Yeah. But then you need to start. You need to start with things that can be done immediately. I mean, restoring the river systems, that's not something you can do right away. Taking out the petrochemicals from their fatty tissues, not done overnight. So you have to start with what can we do right now that could help. And then there are all the long-term things as well. But I think the best thing the NGOs, those who are interested in this, could do is to try to focus on what can be done right now and not be sidetracked by the complexity of the whole thing, because that is actually what I think is happening.
Yeah,
it's
there's many parties.
Distracting because you just keep finding avenues where you find problems. But of course, I do think that stopping fishing for 5 years with an exclusion of people who are indigenous who do use the salmon for for the First Nation people, allowing them to be able to fish, but cutting commercial fishing and just letting the First Nations and the orcas have first gives, and then potentially just allowing one dam out of the 4 that are there to be demolished or to be rerouted so those salmon could make it past their spawning. And I think that those two things combined could really give the population a bounce back, both for the fish and for the orca.
I mean, obviously, I'm from Denmark. I don't know the complexity of all this, so I'm not here to say, oh, you should just do this or just do this. I'm just saying that if there was just one thing that really mattered, if it was only the killer whales that mattered, that's what you would do.
Yeah. Stop fishing.
But of course, it isn't only. I mean, the economy of the fishermen matters too. I mean, there are many things that are at stake. But at least be honest about it and say, well, we're willing to sacrifice the orcas because the fishery is more important. I mean, whatever it is that they think.
It is really complicated. Where there's legislation going on and bills going on, and there's many different companies and invested interests, but the reality is that Canuck is on the brink of extinction, and so is the orca whales on the brink of extinction. And if we have anything to learn from your episodes and experiences in Norway, the fishermen survived that Hearn, sanction, and something like that can happen over in that part of the world too. It's definitely complicated, and we're not going to come up with answers on this interview, but hopefully everything works out. I'm just crossing my fingers.
It would be a long interview to be able to discuss all of those issues in detail.
Yeah. If we could just wave a magic wand, we could find solutions. But God, it's really complicated, and so many people involved. But
I don't know, maybe if we talk loud enough, and maybe if we're coherent enough, maybe we can make something happen. But
hopefully, I mean, we talked about very interesting things here today, and who knows where this conversation is going to lead, and who it'll influence. Maybe something will happen. But let's move over to Australia. Can you talk us a bit about the Australian population of orca, and what was your experiences over there, Hanne?
Well, I discovered this story long time ago, before I went to Australia, and it's a story that I think many people who are interested in killer whales may have heard of before, but again, it's one where I think there's more in it than you usually hear. So the story is about a very, very unusual collaboration between whalers who were hunting the big baleen whales, humpback whales, right whales, in the mid 19th century, from about 1840 or so. And they had a collaboration with killer whales. They simply got help from killer whales in discovering the big baleen whales, in leading the whalers to the place where the killer whales had discovered the big baleen whales, and helping the whalers catch them by harassing them, biting their flippers, throwing themselves on top of the blowhole, making it easier for the whalers to capture them. And this collaboration happened for more than 100 years.
Wow.
So 3 generations of whalers and as many or more generations of killer whales that participated in it. So the whalers learned it from their dad or their granddad, and the same is true for the killer whales. And the killer whales benefited from this by being allowed to eat the tongue and the side of the mouth, the lips of the baleen whale. So the whalers simply left the carcass for the killer whales, so who feasted on it, and then when it floated to the surface after a few days, the whalers went out and brought it into shore. They were not interested in the meat. This was purely for oil whaling at that time. And it's just a fascinating story of how smart killer whales are. And also, I would say how smart these whalers were. They probably learned this from Aboriginals, which is an angle I think I'm adding to the story, which is usually not told, because there was only one whaler in the bay who had this collaboration with killer whales, and that was the whaler who employed Aboriginals in his whaling boats. And there are many stories and songs that the Aboriginals have that tell of this special relationship that they have with whales. So I just think that this is a really amazing story, actually. And I went to the small museum where they still have the skeleton of the last one of the killer whales, which died in 1930. And there are photographs of this. This is not just a fantasy. There are photographs of it, and it's written a lot about it in local Australian papers. And I also spoke to the grandchild of the last whaler, and his name was George Davison, and she remembered her granddad very well. He would sit on the couch showing her pictures of his favorite killer whales.
You mentioned the Aboriginal community there, which is one of the oldest human communities in the world. So does your stories tell more about what relationship the Aboriginal community had with orcas, or is that information lost?
No, there's a little bit. I mean, there's an anthropologist who wrote about this 100 years ago or more, maybe 120 years ago. And he was saying that Aboriginals will light small fires on the coast, and then they would dance and sing, and they would attract killer whales to come close to the shore.
Wow.
And they had this chant or song that they would sing, which was come in, bring the big whales into the shore. So they're kind of trying to attract the killer whales to drive bigger whales into the shore. And there's another story which was told in Australian broadcasting company's radio program by an old Aboriginal man called Gabu Thomas, and he's telling the story. This is not about killer whales, but about dolphins, about how his father and grandfather would take him to the beach and say, now we're going fishing. And this little boy, himself when he was small, didn't understand how they were going to catch fish because they didn't have a fishing rod or a spear or anything. And the grandfather was chanting and walking back and forth on the beach, and the boy here didn't understand a thing about what was going on. And then suddenly in a big wave, dolphins came up and they pushed a shoal of fish onto the beach, and then they had lots of fish, and the grandfather would take one of the dolphins under his arm. He was out in the water. And what makes me think that this is really a true story and that he remembers it very well is that he recalls the sounds of the dolphin, and in the recording he's saying it was saying and it sounds exactly like echolocation sounds when you hear it, and maybe you don't even know what it is. So these small details tells me that this is a guy who clearly remembers what happened, and there are many many relationships that we have or have had to wild animals that we don't have anymore.
It would be amazing if they found cave paintings or something to collaborate the relationship with orcas and other kind of marine life with humans somewhere. That would be kind of cool, wouldn't it?
Yeah, to my knowledge, there is not, at least in Australia, I don't think there's been any paintings of killer whales, but there's a lot of rock carvings in different places of the world of whales and also of killer whales, but we don't know what they mean.
Yeah, but it tells us that we have a relationship with these animals
of course,
for an awfully long time.
Yeah.
Do you want to? We're coming past the hour now, but would you like to talk about Iceland and the sad story about relationship between the American military and the Icelandic community?
Yeah, I'm just going to let the dog out. Is that okay?
Oh, yeah, that's
okay.
Sorry. So yeah, that's it's pretty cool so far, Lena.
It's going pretty good.
Yeah.
Titan got a brief moment of fame.
I seen it, yeah, the cat, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, the story from Iceland is also a story that you see in many books about killer whales, how the US Navy went in and helped the angry fishermen in Iceland by bombing killer whales. And this story I've read many, many times, and I often wondered, like, why did they do that? I mean, I've seen angry fishermen in Norway, but I mean, they didn't ask anyone to bomb them. What was going on? And so I actually went to the National Archive in Iceland and had them find the newspaper articles from that time. It was in the 1950s. And to make a long story short, I found out that, as it often is, it was more complicated than I thought. I thought it was a bit like Norway, that they saw the killer whales as a competitor and they didn't like them. And also, sometimes I've seen that the fishermen were angry because they claimed that the killer whales wrecked the nets. And I found out that the whole thing happened because at that time the fishery was from gill nets. Today, if you fish herring, you use a purse seine net, which is basically a circular net that you surround the herring school with, and then you just tie it in the bottom, and then everything is inside, like in a purse. Whereas gill nets are drift nets that are hanging like curtains in the sea, and the herring or get stuck in the mesh of the net with their gills. And then the fishermen have to take the net very slowly and carefully up because the herring is not attached very firmly. They just hang in their gills. And apparently the killer whales had found out that if they swam through the net, all the herring would fall off. It doesn't take more. A fisherman just have to shake a net with a gill net, and then all the herring will fall off. That's why they have to draw it in very carefully. So if a killer whale just swam through it, all the herring would fall off. But more than that, the net would actually be wrecked because nets at that time were not made from nylon, but from cotton. And a cotton net very quickly gets tired and worn and fragile. So it's actually true that the killer whales were wrecking the net, not because they were mean, but just because that's how they got all the herring loose. So it became a complicated story of fishermen who were losing their income, losing their catch, and losing their nets. And these were dirt poor fishermen. So I understand their frustration. And then they asked the government to help, and the government asked the US Navy, who had a base in Keflavik outside Reykjavik, and they did go up in bombing planes and bomb the killer whales. And this happened for 4 years in a row. And it was a pretty gruesome thing, a horrible thing. And then in 59, it kind of blew over. It was over. Now suddenly fishermen were reporting that, there are killer whales, then that means it's herring, it's a good thing. But that actually also coincided with the time when they switched to purse seining and to nylon nets. So that solved the problem. But it was a story of depredation. It wasn't a story of killer whales being mean and wrecking nets. And it wasn't a story either of fishermen being completely
ruthless.
Or irrational. Seen from their perspective, I can understand that they were very frustrated. It's a bit like what's happening in Portugal and Spain now, where killer whales, for some reason that we still don't understand, are wrecking boats. But here they were wrecking nets, and it was a big problem for the fishermen. So it's a complicated story, and it was interesting to find out what it was really about.
And now we have the problem with nylon nets, being lost and having.
Oh yeah, that's a huge problem. Even in Kamchatka, we pulled out a huge net that was left drifting in the sea that we fished out. And there barely room for us in the boat after we got it on board.
And there doesn't seem to be a solution to that, that problem.
No.
Unless we have some biodegradable material invented for nets. That's it's a massive problem all over the world.
Well, the damaged nets and broken things that get lost while fishing, it's a contamination problem in the ocean. But bycatch is also one of those hot potato concepts that she mentions in the book, is that there is a lot of controversy in what gets caught and what are the regulations. If orcas get in the nets, orcas have been drowned. And not just individually in those stories, but like kind of across the board, dolphins do like to get into the nets. So that's a wildly unregulated thing too.
Yeah.
If we look at history, we know that boaters started off with hemp. They used hemp as a material to make nets, and then it was cotton in other places, and now it's nylon. But hopefully, if that pattern holds, we'll have some kind of new material that they can use in the future, and that'll solve the problem for at least the future. But now we have to deal with the nets that are already left in the ocean. There is some kind of campaigns to kind of free the Great Pacific Garbage Patch of plastic. There's, I think, one of the Rothschild children, believe it or not, is involved in that program. So there's progress. So what we'll do is we'll move on to the captive subject.
Yeah.
We won't get too involved in that subject because our group is non-captive primarily. We don't discuss the parks or the brand behind it because we don't want to influence people to go there. But what we can discuss is the psychologies of humans going to the parks and why they would be attracted to go there to see these animals in such an artificial environment with artificial behaviors. And you talk about that in your book, Hanne, but it was one of the points that one of the other members discussed and wanted to question you to kind of delve into that a bit deeper. So if you have any kind of
Well, I'm just speculating. Because
okay.
I don't know, but I'm speculating. I think it's really odd that we say we love killer whales. We think they're wonderful. We want to see them in a marine park. But what you see in a marine park is not a wild killer whale. It's you don't see their wild behaviors. You don't see what is, in my view, interesting and fascinating about killer whales. That's actually more or less gone when you see them in a marine park. And so I am speculating if some of the attraction of seeing a wild animal like a killer whale or a lion or other animals in captivity is that we don't see their wild behavior, that we like to see them Disneyfied in a way, that we see some kind of new version of an animal which is toothless and doesn't have all the things that we see in the wild. So I'm actually just speculating that I think for some people the attraction seems to be that they're not wild, and then the whole thing doesn't make any sense to me anymore.
Well, the thing that confuses me the most is that when you go to SeaWorld, they educate you. They really have this strange push that it's an education about these animals, while also completely denying everything that makes them wild and beautiful. And that's what I noticed when I was very, very young, personally, is that, the first time I saw them, I was just so impressed by the size and the bold coloration and the power of the animal, and a little bit entranced by the communication and the interaction between the trainers and the orcas. Personally, I found that very interesting when I was 4. But then fast forward to 11, my family took me again because I was so interested. And then I felt deep, deep shame for going when I was 11 versus 4. So I think that, not everybody realizes that right away, but if you are interested, it does come into play that there's something wrong even if you don't see it.
Yeah, I mean, there is something wrong. I am totally sure that there are people at SeaWorld who are doing a good job and who are trying very hard to make good conservation measures and all that stuff, and also have a good intention, I think. But for me, it boils down to you just can't have killer whale captivity in a good way, and from it that's just where it ends.
It is where it ends for that. But I've read a lot of accounts on trainers that have left SeaWorld, and they, the underlying message from every single one of them is we stayed to advocate for these animals and make sure that we could limit mistreatment and that they could make sure that they were taken care of to the best of human ability. But it always comes down to there is no good way to keep them in captivity, keep them emotionally, physically healthy, free of disease, and the proper interactions that they need. And I think that that's like kind of where it gets to the point where we want to talk like to Lori Marino about her whale sanctuary. Have you heard of Lori Marino? She's working towards doing like safe sea pens for release of animals that have been in captivity, which I think is like the best outcome for a lot of these animals, is to get like sea pens because they can't really be integrated.
I think refrain from going into that discussion because I don't know enough about it to really say anything clever. I can say that for my own person, I don't like watching killer whales in a marine park. I've seen it once or twice maybe, and I didn't like it, and that's just the way it is. What's the best way to do with them afterwards? I don't have a strong opinion on that because I don't know enough.
For me, I detest the idea of it. I detest the idea of abducting these whales from their natural environment and their social pods and putting into this pen for commercial use. It's indentured servitude from an intelligent animal, and
Absolutely.
the owners of these parks have zero moral standing and ethics, and I actually don't think they give two hoots regarding the quality of life of these animals. And as soon as they can stop making a profit from them, I don't think they're interested in giving them any other quality of life in a sea pen. And what's a sea pen with a mentally disturbed animal being, given food to perform tricks? The quality of life of these animals is abysmal. And yes, I would like them to be out of parks, because obviously parks, but I think that the practice should be banned worldwide. And I don't understand the psychology of people bringing or going to these things, because it just boggles my mind. I know, like, there's zoos and there's animals quite happy, it seems, in zoos like Dublin Zoo and so on, where they have conservation efforts between the rhinos and other animals like that, and they do some of them do some good work in terms of conservation. But marine parks are a different entity altogether. They're a profit only organization, and they should not exist.
Well, it's hard to dissuade people like that from making that type of money. But I think that, I think that reaching the people more than the company is a lot more approachable, because you can't dissuade these people with no morals to not take money or make arbitrary values for animals that are arguably priceless. You can't do it. It just, you gotta reach the people.
It would be brilliant to put together some kind of educational program to hit people at a very early age. But it seems like from people in the group, there are two minds. One is, I can't afford to go on a touring expedition into the water because it costs anywhere between €2,000 to €6,000, versus the guaranteed viewing of a killer whale in these marine parks.
Yeah, but that, if you ask me, is not a viewing. It's not a viewing of a killer whale. It really isn't, because that's not what they are.
It's not what they are.
I do think it's a bit of a circus, but not a well-run one. So
for me, I absolutely detest them. I think it is an absolute crime on the animal kingdom. I'll go as far as that. Like, it is an absolute crime.
I would assign shame and disgust towards the industry.
Yeah, to the industry. And obviously people going there, like, that are kids, don't have the education, don't have the kind of information before going there. But you see an awful lot in the group as well, that the experiences like Lena's, that they go to these things and they have the realization of what they are, and they never go there again. So,
well, it sparks an interest in young people, and I think that's like the biggest pull that they have, is it does spark an interest. I mean, if you can guarantee see seals and dolphins and whatever they put up there, kids will beg their parents to do it. Parents will let them.
They call that pester power in marketing. But it's not something I approve.
There are also other ways of fostering an interest, in ways that I think are better and more solid, actually.
One of the best ways, Hannah, is the whale museum.
Yeah.
The whale museum. Somewhere you go and you get educated, and you get to see these animals in their natural environment without harming them, without pulling them from their families. No
specimen, live cams, live cam skeletons, like models, activities,
animatronics.
Animatronics at the very minimum for that. I wish that kind of experience was available in America, and I wish that was something that I could have seen as a child. And I know in the group we do have.
But I hope we'll set a new standard, and
that'd be brilliant.
Maybe there can be more the whale institutions in other parts of the world.
You're a leader, Hanne. You're a leader in that. And hopefully the exhibitions that you do in Norway, hopefully you'll highlight them on the group. Give us a little video.
Absolutely will make sure to do that, of course.
Please do, yeah.
Yeah,
and
we do have young people on the group. We have kids as young as 4 and 6 on our group that are absolutely interested, and everything that they post, their parents show them because they're just that fanatic at that young age. So
speaking about young people, Elena, we have big fans of yours, Hanne, and the group, and they're like Elena will go into further who they are, but they want to have a shout out for you from you, if that's okay.
At some point. So I have a 6-year-old named Riley that follows everything that I post, and her mom makes sure to show her everything because I write accessible stories about killer whales for children. And it makes Riley so excited. She looks forward to those. And so she could have, you know, a real marine biologist, a real scientist reach out and say, like, you know, pursue your dreams. That would be so cute for Riley.
So she would appreciate it.
You can.
Yes,
I think that Nick will actually edit this portion, so it's just more of a shout out. But
I'll leave this in if you don't mind. I think it's great for, you know, people like Hanne and Elena to influence the young people, become marine biologists and become the army that orcas need to keep them in the healthy and safe environments that they live in. So if you don't mind, Hanne or Elena,
I love to
give some information on Riley and then go for it.
Hi Riley, this is a message to you and to all other children who are interested in whales and orcas and the marine life and the oceans. Keep being interested in the ocean. Keep learning. Keep going to the sea. Ask your parents for books. Look at documentaries, but keep learning. We need you to be interested. The whole world depends on you picking up and learning and becoming interested in whales. So please do that.
I got shivers down my spine about that. Imagine being a kid and hearing that. That's amazing.
Goose feathers.
Yeah.
I wish someone said that to me when I was little.
It's an amazing message. Thank you, Hanne, and thank you, Elena. This is the first in the series, hopefully a series of videos and interviews that we do in the future. It's been an amazing experience, and thank you from myself, and I'm sure everyone that's listening would be very grateful too. And if you have anything to say, Elena or Hanne, please feel free.
I just have a question. How will people access this?
Sure, it'll be. I'll edit it down and make an intro and exit, and then I'll post it up on the group.
Fantastic.
And it'll be published on the group.
To watch it at leisure.
Fantastic. And I will give, if you want to, I'll give you a copy of the file that you can actually post onto your own profiles as well, Hanne and Elena.
It's plenty that I link it.
Yeah. Oh, you can't link it, unfortunately, because the group is a private group. So if you linked it, it will just say this information is not available in this.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'll give you a file, and you can.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Or actually, I'll put it on YouTube, and then link will be free.
That's, I think, is even better.
Yeah. Okay.
So I just wanted to thank you for your time. We're so grateful that you were able to join us today, to get information out and just to have more of a physical presence here in America, because I don't know that a lot of people in America know who you are, and I think that they should. I didn't until Nick. I didn't know who you were until Nick just emailed me and said, "You want to do an interview?" And I was like, "What?"
So what I'll do,
Nick, could you say to people that if they read the book, they're very welcome, whether they like it or not, to rate the book?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
So if you're interested in reading my book, The Killer Whale Journals, I think you can get it just about everywhere you would normally buy a book, whether it's Barnes and Nobles or Amazon or bookshops, real bookshops. They should have it. And basically, the book is about orcas or killer whales in different parts of the world and our sometimes troubled relationship with them. But it's also a book that has a lot of hope. It basically is about how we can transform attitudes and work for the conservation of these incredible animals that I'm totally fascinated about.
Great. And everyone who buys the book, please don't forget to leave a review, especially on Amazon. That's going to help Anna a lot. It's going to push that book up in the ranking. So, and that definitely deserves it. It's a fascinating look into the lives of humans and orcas' relationship across the world, and on topics that you probably haven't heard of before. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a movie going on in the future for Hanne. Maybe, hopefully. We need more movies.
Hey, people get documentaries. You could get a documentary.
Absolutely. I believe that.
That would be fantastic.
Yeah.
Let's make some more documentaries. That would be fun.
Yeah, I know some people. We'll email them.
So thank you very much, Elena, and thank you very much, Hanne. We'll end it here. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you both. It's been fun. I'm going to catch the dog now. Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.